Leadership in South Africa. I want to just spend a few minutes talking about leadership requirements in South Africa for South Africa to perform well and get out of the current decline it's in. And I know there are positive things being said by the South African government. Cyril Ramaphosa is making bold statements about bringing in investors with deep pockets to do a lot of good things. And that's great. If you can get investors to go in there, that'll be fantastic. I am more skeptical, in terms of that, because I don't think that's going to be quite as easy as it sounds. But when I talk about leadership, we know about what happened at Eskom and Imperial Holdings very recently with Mark Lambert's resignation. With more and more, and I know many good leaders that have left South Africa over the last 10 years, it brings me on to a newsreel I saw yesterday on the South African news channel, who were interviewing the CEO of South African Airways. And I think let's have a look at this first. For those of you who aren't in South Africa, just have a good look at this interview.
Deputy Finance Minister Mondli Gungubele said yesterday that the national carrier South African Airways will need at least 20 billion rand in order to break even in 3 years' time. This after the airline posted a loss of 5.6 billion rand in the 2016-2017 financial year, with another 7 billion in losses projected in the next 2 years. So the question is the airline fixable, and will yet another turnaround strategy rescue it from ruin? We're joined in the studio by CEO Vuyani Jahana. Good evening to you, and thank you for talking to us. Those figures that were announced in Parliament, we're talking about billions casually, but it is in fact a lot of money.
No, it is. It is a lot of money. I think South Africans and the shareholder would realize that the airline business is a capital-intensive business and it's a very low-margin business. So those numbers are not out of kilt from an investment point of view in terms of global airlines. What's important is that the reinvestment in successful airlines comes out of returned earnings. In the case of SAA, it's been making losses, therefore there are capital calls that the shareholder needs to come forward with.
So many people would say, isn't it time to throw in the towel? How many more billions must taxpayers keep forking out to save this airline?
So I think South Africans will realize that SAA has a very material role that it plays in the economy in terms of the travel market in the continent internationally. However, that role needs to be fulfilled in a very profitable way. And I don't think there are easy answers, because, even if you were to take a very different decision, the cost of taking a different decision than a strategic turnaround are much more higher than the ask we're putting on the table for the strategic turnaround approach.
Well, people would say since 2011, 20 billion rand has been injected into the airline. Not a single year has it shown profit, and yet more billions are still required from the fiscus. So even if you talk about the other option costing more money, well, that's exactly what we're doing now.
Look, Bongani, one of the key things is that South Africans will realize most of what government has done is to raise guarantees and actually enabling SA to go and raise debt. Now, there is an optimum debt capacity for any business, and in that case, in the case of SA has been having a debt burden. It doesn't mean, though, that if it's debt, you should not execute strategy appropriately. But there's a fine line between overburdening the company and actually gearing it correctly. I think SA is overgeared.
Look, I have some sympathy with you. Obviously, you've just come into this picture, but I sit here and I think I remember having interviews with, going back to Khaya Ngula's time 10 years ago, and he was talking about turnaround strategies. He was talking about recapitalization. That was 10 years ago. We're back here. It feels like Groundhog Day.
What's important is consistency in leadership. SAA has had inconsistency in leadership instability. So a good business has got executive that stay longer, bring in skills, and has got a shareholder who has a very, very clear view of what they want to do with the business. I think what you can see is leadership instability for many years.
The bottom line is that many people will say that the shareholder appears to have this bag of money that just simply doesn't run out. If we're looking at what the Deputy Finance Minister said to Parliament, 9.2 billion rand in debt that comes due in March next year. You need a further 12 billion rand over the next 3 years without buying a single aircraft.
Well, this is the cost of doing business. This is the cost of doing
It's a
business.
vanity project, people would say, though. I mean, I understand from your point of view in trying to save it, but what benefit is this to the taxpayer?
Absolutely. I think the big part of it is that government has already indicated to South Africans that they is considering a mixed model of ownership, which is beginning to say private sector investment in SAA to bring a lot more capacity to do transformation, to actually make sure you've got operating leverage, but also to get investment from private sector to come invest alongside government. And I think government has made that call now.
Well, some in the private sector, certainly your critics, are saying privatization and finding an equity investor to inject cash would also be a pipe dream. They're saying that there's nothing worth investing in now left at SAA.
So we've always maintained that it's going to take us cleaning up SAA, transforming it into a better shape, getting to the break-even point to be able to make SAA attractive. I must also say, though, that in airline, there's other assets which are soft asset landing slots across the globe. So even though the main part of the business may not be in good shape today, but SAA has got assets in terms of landing slot globally. So that could be an opportunity for equity investor to see see that attractive in SAA.
But you've got basic problems of just record keeping. You don't even know what's being stolen as we sit here.
This is the reason why some of us have signed up to be there. That's why we're recruiting key executives to come into SAA and work with the people of SAA to transform that.
Basic thing about your inventory?
Well, the inventory management system, we have had problems with in terms of the SAA Technical, for example, between SAP and Amos, implementing new inventory system and doing stock audits, and all those things are being fixed today. We're focusing on them to make sure that they are done right. We must remember that SAA has had acting leadership for a long period of time in different roles, not only in the top level, across the organization. So lack of leadership stability, consistency in execution, you get this type of results. So this is what we have to fix.
Look, it's a difficult one because even the Auditor General has said without this continued government funding, he doubts that there's even a case for business rescue here because without government funding, you couldn't really guarantee that you could be a going concern. And all of these issues are going to keep being a headache.
Yeah, they will. And that's why it's important that the shareholder understands that if you do not put capital into the business, all you do is raise guarantees, there is a point where you get to the situation that we're in. The 9.2 billion rand is a billion rand of debt that has 9.2 billion rand of debt that has been accumulated over years. Now, to get to a going concern status, there is a need to inject capital into the business or extend those loans to a longer period of time so that we're able to operate. So these are the things that the board is seized with together with the shareholder. A joint oversight committee has been formed between Treasury and the SAA board, looking exactly at the optimum capital structure of SAA and how do we fund it towards the break-even point.
Well, you've stepped into the fire, that's for sure. We wish you luck in terms of what you do and what you implement. Let's hope that 10 years from now, you and I or whoever replaces you at some point will not be having the same conversations. That's the CEO of South African Airways, Mr. Vuyani Jahana.
South African Airways clearly has some very severe hemorrhage problems in terms of what it's losing. And let me be quite frank on this. I mean, the airline industry is not an easy industry to make money in. Even the likes of the global giants like Emirates Airlines, they lose a lot of money. Some years they lose a hell of a lot of money, but they have deep pockets and they can maintain modern fleets and bring in the best in service that's around on a regular basis, and go out of their way to fly unprofitable routes sometimes to get to a strategic end in what they want to do. In South African Airways case, it's not so easy with where they haven't got deep pockets and they've got to rely on taxpayers to fund them. And I understand, they're borrowing at the moment. And again, I don't see a foreign investor wanting to get involved in developing South African Airways in its current state. I would look at it strategically very, very much on this sort of scale, and this is based on my own experience in looking at airline business developments in other parts of the world. And I haven't done any research on South African Airways, so just take what I say with some sort of understanding that I am not an expert on South African retail. Louis, stop sniffing. That's my dog. Sorry, sniffing away there. First of all, I would say to the executive of South African Airways, structure your fleet to service Africa well to start with. In other words, all the airports across Africa, try and ensure you've got a service going into those areas where African transport is going backwards and forwards between other African states, particularly in southern Africa and central Africa, and in parts of West Africa. That would be the first part of the focus I would work on, because I know for a fact European businesses that look in Africa for development do find it difficult to get on direct flights on occasion. I mean, I've been battling to get into Sierra Leone directly from London. I've had to go via another European airline. So I think there is opportunity to develop the network for passenger service in Africa as South African Airways. And I would forget about Europe, and I forget about the Middle East, I forget about Asia, and I forget about the Americas, quite honestly. Let the big boys handle those routes for the time being. Because you're not going to be able to do them cheaper. When it does come to transportation outside of Africa, I think you should look very seriously at air freight. South African Airways, for what I understand, sold its only freight cargo aircraft it had, and doesn't have any real freight aircraft now that are just freight. All it carries is freight in its holds. But I would look at freight. And why do I say that? Because I think there's more money to be made in it to start off with than there is in passengers. South Africa has got a lot of product that could be moved into Europe and into the States that requires air freight. I'm thinking in the lines of the soft fruit items, the fresh food items, and those kind of product categories. Now, I know for a fact that the Emirates Sky Cargo does a lot of that as well. But I'm saying that's an area where South Africa might be able to gain an edge if they set themselves up cleverly to do that. Convert some of their aircraft to become freighters rather than passenger-going aircraft. And obviously look at your freight consolidation areas at the airports in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Durban, and in Johannesburg in particular. I'd also look then at your freight services that can be linked up with other countries in Africa. Kenya, we know there's a lot of product that goes air freight into Europe. Mozambique, we know there's a lot of product that goes into Europe. Ghana and Nigeria, we know there's product that goes into Europe. Now, that is quite important as a link out. Coming back, I'm saying there's also an opportunity for air freight coming from Europe into Africa and into South Africa. And I'm thinking things there like pharmaceutical products. I'm talking, the items that require refrigeration, the perishable type of pharmaceuticals, those sort of medicines. I'm thinking about particular electronic engineering items that require an amount of time air freight to be air freighted into the market in Africa. So I think there's an opportunity for freight commerce, and that's what South African Airways should be focusing on. Out of that interview, I couldn't get any clarity in terms of where the CEO is putting focus, other than dodging a lot of questions, quite honestly. But I do think if South Africa is to have a carrier, that's the way to develop it. It's got to focus a lot more on its passenger fleet for Africa, and it's got to focus a lot more on air freight, because there are a lot of products that are air freighted out of South Africa being carried by other airlines at the moment, and there's a lot of products being air freighted into South Africa and across Africa. And I think if South Africa can get that right, South African Airways, they'll start to go on a winning curve and it will get better for them. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Bye-bye.